Actually, Stephen Cary, I've been interviewing winemakers of yesterday and today, and your name has come up quite a bit as being the godfather of Steamboat. What is Steamboat exactly?
Steamboat's a conference, a meeting of Pinot Noir producers from all over the world at this point. And it started back in 1980 because of an event, a dinner at my house in Salem, Oregon, with a California Pinot Noir producer and a Oregon sommelier and an Oregon chef and myself. And at that time I was a salesman, a wine salesman. And after a lot of Burgundy, late in the evening, this guy says, you know, we should have a meeting of Oregon and California Pinot Noir producers to talk about how to make the wine better. The New World didn't know anything about making Pinot Noir at that time. There had been a smattering of it grown in California over the years, but it was forgotten down there. And it was exploding here in Oregon. And we realized that there was a steep learning curve. And if we could share information, we could short-circuit that learning curve, tighten it up. So the idea struck a chord with me. Even though it was 1 o'clock in the morning when it happened, I remembered, and I said, well, I'll organize it for this first year. I'll get Myron to help me, and we'll hold it. I know the place to have it. There's this fishing lodge down on the North Umpqua River where we can go, and we'll be out of the way, where we can talk openly and share very, very openly.
And the fact that most of his early people also happened to be avid fly fishermen had nothing to do with the location.
No. I just happened to know Steamboat. My friends of mine own the place, and I knew that it was a great spot. So we booked into Steamboat Inn on the North Umpqua River for what became known as the Pinot Noir Society, or the Pinot Noir Association meeting. And eventually, I mean, the idea was we'd have it 1 year in Oregon and the next year in California. So we had it in Oregon. It was a big success, big hit at Steamboat. Next year we went to California. And the guy down there just kind of let it slip through the cracks that, well, he didn't get that hotel up in the mountains booked. In fact, so we had it in Napa Valley at our friend Mike Richmond's house. Mike was one of the other guys who were instrumental in starting this thing. And it was great. We had this fabulous tasting during the day at his house, and had these California winemakers and these 12 Oregon winemakers that had driven down to the valley. And we were having this wonderful tasting. It went on all afternoon. And at 4 o'clock, tasting was over, all the Californians got up and went home. Well, at Steamboat, you're all together. You're together for dinner, and you're together for 3 days. So you establish a different camaraderie. In California, it wasn't there because we were too close to their homes. So we came back to Oregon, and next year, again, Steamboat was a huge success, and by now it's growing. More wineries are hearing about it, and people want to come. And we go to California the next year, and the same thing happened. We blew it again. Somebody didn't make the reservations up in the mountains, and we're all in Napa, and we have a wonderful time, but everybody gets up and goes home at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. So after the 4th year, we said, that's it. It's going to be held in Oregon. It's going to be held at Steamboat from now on. And it has been there ever since. This is our 25th year coming up.
What sort of innovations have come out of this? What have y'all learned?
Oh my God.
Myron.
Why is this an important conference? I mean, so you sit around and talk about...
Well, I remember the first year we were down there, we were tasting a lot of, I think it was the 78 and 79 vintage, and the wine after wine was high pH, almost tawny brown kind of things, and they didn't have any of the things that we associated with Burgundy. That's sort of the acidity and structure and so forth. And we would taste through these wines, and I think this is one of in the early days, we didn't have as many people from around the world, so we would just all go out and buy wines from Burgundy and California and Oregon, and if there wasn't a producers. And we found that we would start to talk about how to make something better, and we would taste a wine that we thought exhibited it, and then we couldn't talk to the person, and that was one of the real frustrations.
We looked at issues of ripeness and production. Those early wines were made as if we were making Cabernet, totally differently than we make wines today. We were growing fruit and looking for different things in ripeness than we look for today. I would say every aspect of Pinot Noir growing and production has been examined, and huge amounts of change have come out of Steamboat. And this is not to pat myself on the back. This is because this entity has a life of its own. And its strength comes from the fact that you have the best minds in the New World, and in many times from the Old World also, who make Pinot Noir, sharing information.
And the honesty at Steamboat is something that you won't see anywhere. I've never seen it anywhere else, because the credo of Steamboat is that what's said here stays here, and we're not here to worry about legalisms or anything. We're here to improve Pinot. So somebody will get up and say, a California winemaker will get up and say, you know, if you have a warmer year and the flavors in Pinot don't come up until you get very high bricks, then you gotta go for the high bricks, and then you have to add back water to to drop the alcohol and bring everything back into perspective. That's how you make Pinot in a warmer vintage or a warmer climate. And that was, completely illegal. And then we would have a French winemaker who would come over and who would say, well, under Burgundy appellation laws, you're supposed to dump all your sugar in when you chapitalize at one time, and that is stupid most of the time. So, we add our sugar bit by bit through the season. And, if a French policeman was there, the guy would be busted. But this was all the spirit of, look, the problem is, how do you make the wine? Another thing I remember, because the last few years, I think earlier we talked about viticulture, and as Steve says, harvest parameters and so forth. And then for several years we've talked about some of the wine defects, and one of the problems that we've all battled is hydrogen sulfide. And I still remember this California winemaker sitting there saying, look, if you want to take care of hydrogen sulfide, the first time you smell it, you add 1 part per million, which is twice the legal limit. And then if it comes back the next day, you add 2 parts. And if it comes back the next day, you add 4, and you add 5. And we're all sitting there going, what? This, crazy man. And he said, and then when you get done with fermentation, you analyze the wine, and there's no copper left, because the yeast metabolize it all, and it all falls out, and it'll take care of the problem. But again, if a BATF person came to your winery and you were shown adding copper during the fermentation, even though it doesn't end up, you would, and so it's that kind of honesty, and people not bullshitting, BSing each other.
We realized from the start, Myron, Mike Richard, and others who have been involved from the get-go, that Pinot Noir was the unknown American wine. It was at a tremendous disadvantage from a marketing perspective, in that California didn't spend any energy on it, and Oregon was brand new. So the point was, if we're going to survive, we've got to put out high quality wines as rapidly as we can. And the reason that this conference works, in my mind, is unique, in that there is no other conference like it on earth for any other variety. There's no Merlot conference or Zinfandel conference where winemakers share their secrets. There are other Pinot Noir conferences now that are direct knockoffs with our blessing. But the reason that it works is because Pinot Noir expresses the place that it grows. It describes its terroir. And my terroir is different from Myron's, and is different from anybody else's. So if he wins a gold medal, or I win a gold medal, and I tell him exactly how I made my wine, his won't taste the same. So we give up nothing by sharing. We gain from the experience of our fellow makers. The conference at the start was disjointed, not highly organized. We brought wines together that we'd purchased, that we'd made, that were already in bottle, that were finished wines. And we learned a lot from it, but with David Adelsheim's help in particular, we realized that it made sense to look at our wines before we put them in the bottle. Look at our unfinished wines. So you make the wine in the fall, and the next summer at Steamboat, we'd be looking at our barrel samples. And that's when we really started learning, this is what I can still do to this wine, this is what's right with this wine, this is what's wrong with this wine. And this happened just about the same time as the inception of the International Pinot Noir celebration here in McMinnville. McMinnville, we were 8 years old when IPNC started. And IPNC invited the Drouhins, among other French, to come the first year to the IPNC, so we naturally included them in Steamboat. And that's when we really started becoming international. That's when we became international in scope. It's when we really got the format down that can teach us the most about how to improve our wines. I remember Robert sitting through the first tasting, the first morning tasting, where we look at several flights of wines blind, and there'll be one wine from every producer show up at some point during the 3 days. So now you've got 7 or 8 wines in front of you, and you smell and taste these and make your notes, and then you critique them to your fellow makers. At the end of the first session, Robert turned to David and said, we could never do this in Burgundy. There is so much competition, and there's so little sense of sharing that we could never do this in Burgundy. 2 years ago at Steamboat, a Frenchman turned to me and said, I think it's time we take this format to Burgundy. 15 years between those two statements. That's light speed in French.
Let's talk about marketing. There are a lot of marketing challenges facing you. Can you speak to some of them? And I understand you were quite instrumental in international marketing yourself.
I got active in international marketing sort of by a happy accident of meeting somebody who wanted to start. So I started working up in Canada, and we found that Eastern Canada had a European palate. And so when Oregon wines were introduced to the Toronto and Ontario market, the people went crazy over them. They really liked them because they didn't have what we in the industry call a California palate. They had a European palate. And Oregon wines are more analogous to European because of our climatological parallels with both cooler climates and so forth. So I got interested in that, and then I sold wine in England at a fairly early stage, and I worked with Washington State, and together we formed what's called the Pacific Northwest Wine Marketing Coalition. This was about, gosh, I'm trying to remember how many years ago, but maybe 10. And together we were able to apply to the U.S. government's Foreign Agricultural Service funds for helping export American products and develop funding to help wineries develop markets overseas. There are two major challenges in international marketing. One is currency fluctuations. The thing that I told you about when we started out, we did so well in Canada, the American dollar shot up, our prices went through the roof, and our sales died for most people who weren't willing to. The Oregon industry at the same time was riding a wave, and many people weren't willing to make any price adjustments, and so the export market basically died. The English pound went up. So that's one problem. Now we're on a downhill, so the dollar's going down. That's great. The other problem is just trying to convince my colleagues in Oregon that there isn't much difference between selling your wine in Toronto or London or Stockholm or Tokyo than there is in Georgia or Texas or Pennsylvania. I mean, in many ways, it's easier for me to sell wine into England than it is to sell wine into Pennsylvania, which is a state-controlled state. And we send out notices to our colleagues in the industry about opportunities where they have funds to help them, and we get no response. Yet when I talk to those same people in functions, they have wine they want to sell. And so I think right now, if I was to say the major problem for export for Oregon, I would say it is that getting people that have wine to sell to realize that the foreign market is not as daunting as they think it is.
The issues that face Oregon Pinot Noir today are different than they were when we started 30 years ago. Today, in the New World, we have competition. California has taken to this variety in a big way and has planted a great deal in places that are warmer than they are here, that create a style of wine that is very pleasant to a palate that has cut its teeth on warmer climate viticulture. So that's a big part of competition in America. We have competition from other places in the New World today. Chile is beginning to plant Pinot Noir. Australia has taken to the variety in the last 10 years. And New Zealand has taken to it in a big way. And after 40 plus years here of growing Pinot Noir, in 20 years, they have planted the same number of acres that we have. So we have New World competition. However, when we add all of the Pinot Noir land on Earth together, it accomplishes less than 2% of premium wine sales. And this is the golden age, the beginning of golden age of Pinot Noir, in my mind, because people are finally getting to this variety. And if we can get just 1% more of the market drinking Pinot Noir, we'll all be out of wine. Now, right now, there is certainly plenty of juice around, grapes and juice around. I would admit that we have a mini glut. But I've been in this business so long that I've seen 3 gluts in America alone of various varieties, like Napa Cabernet, that have created the greatest gloom and doom forecasts. And the average time it took before prices rose again is 11 months. So yes, we do have momentary surges, and we will continue to have those as a young industry. But this is the beginning of the real age of Pinot Noir. And Oregon Pinot Noir has the most footing, the most understanding around the globe of any New World place. So by taking Myron's advice and going to more places internationally where people already perhaps understand cool climate European wines, we have an enormous potential in front of us. It may be easier in Tokyo or London than it is in Los Angeles. But it's there to be had if we spend the energy. Marketing, dollars, and time.
And so is that the answer? Marketing, dollars, and time? Or
It's awareness of which markets to attack and an open mind to realize that some are going to work better than others, and maybe an international scope as opposed to trying to win the hearts and souls of people who prefer warmer climate wine.
Yeah, and you know, what's that slogan? In the home of the blind, the one-eyed king is
One-eyed man
is king. Thank you, Steve. You know, Oregon wine sales in Oregon exploded when we, the industry, took on and did some tastings with our colleagues from Burgundy in New York in the early 80s, when people said that there was no comparison between Oregon Pinot and Burgundy, and we showed the world that yes, there is a comparison. When that happened, suddenly the home market exploded, and sales of wine in our own state and in the Northwest, you know, exploded. And I think the point that Steve's making is, for example, in Japan, Burgundy is still the god. the king god. And we're talking about having a tasting in Japan to show the Japanese sommeliers in public in a blind tasting that, just like the New Yorkers found out, what, 20 years ago?
September 24th, 1985.
Yeah, that Oregon Pinot is playing in the same ballpark as Burgundy. You know, we make world-class Pinot Noir here. And if we turn heads in Tokyo, if we turn heads in London, if we turn heads in Stockholm, then we'll see a surge back in the United States, because people say, oh my God, look, Oregon Pinot did so well out there, and they'll come back to it. And I think that's one of the things. I mean, the reason the industry is going to Stockholm is because we had wine writers, the two top wine writers from Sweden, came and spent about 4 days tasting Oregon wines, and then they came and had dinner with us, and this has never happened to me before in all the years I've been in the business, to have major wine writers sit there and say, your product, not Amity, but your product from Oregon is so good that you have to bring it and show it to us in Sweden. Please, we will help you. And they went back to Sweden and they helped us set up a tasting. Now, I think that's fairly incredible, but as Steve says, the world stage is where we're starting to play, and it's exciting.
In the Pinot Noir variety, it's impossible to make great wines at high yield. So we're never going to be able to make really inexpensive, good Pinot Noir. We're always going to be $15 and above for good wine. And that means that we have to find the customer that's willing to pay that. As opposed to lowering our prices and losing money, we simply have to go and find the market that can pay $15, $20, $30 a bottle for us to survive. And that means we have to look internationally. We have to think globally. There are two events in particular that are very important in the early marketing history. The Gomio tasting in Paris in 1979, where David Lett's Cary Vineyard did well, and that tasting was repeated in Burgundy by Robert Drouin setting up. And in the repeat, David's wine did even better. It turned out to be second in the whole tasting by 1/10 of a point to a Grand Cru Burgundy. And that was the first event that made somebody outside of Oregon aware that we had a wine industry. And the second was this tasting in 1985, in September of 85, where we just got tired of being told that we were okay, but we would never challenge the Burgundians, of course.
Yeah, we could make good Bourgogne, but...
Yeah, forget high quality.
Right.
We just said, well, look, we'll hire you. This is an independent body in New York called the International Wine Center. We said, we'll hire you to put on a tasting. You pick the Burgundies, you pick the Oregon wines out of anything that you want, and then you pick the judges. And you pick the judges out of the best Pinot Noir Burgundy minds in New York. So they did. And there were 10 Oregon Pinots there and 7 Burgundies. The Burgundies range from commune wine to Grand Cru. And the Oregon wines were selected out of all the wineries that sent to be included, and they picked 10 out of that. And our hope was, well, you know, we'll come out in the middle and we'll look good, because our average bottle price at that point was about $11, and the Burgundies averaged 27. So there was, you know, if we can fall in the middle, we'll look good. Well, we asked the judges 2 things: the origin of the wine, you only have 2 choices, and your 3 favorite choices. Nobody in that group of 25 judges got 50% right on origin, A, and B, Oregon got 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th and tied for 5th. That showed up in the Wine Spectator and made a huge difference.
Yeah, it was, and the other event was Robert Parker's first trip out to Oregon. And it's kind of funny, because I had told I have a standing rule at my winery that nobody without my permission is to taste unmade wines. And Robert Parker came by my winery, and my staff ignored my
he has very smart people.
Request, and they served him our 1983 Winemakers Reserve Pinot. And Parker went back and raved about mine and a whole bunch of other fine Oregon Pinots and called it the finest Pinot he'd ever tried outside of Burgundy, and then started his excitement with Oregon Pinot. And that, combined with the event that Steve's talking about, launched it. I mean, there's a funny story. We used to say, how does Dick Erath market Pinot? This was during the early 80s, and the answer was, well, he builds another warehouse, because up until about 1985, you know, everybody was increasing production, but we had all this production, we weren't selling very well, and the event that Steve talked about happened, and then Parker happened like the next year or so, and I remember...
Wine started moving.
Wine started moving. Erath didn't have to build any more warehouses, and Sokolblasser said they went from 5 backed up vintages to sold out in 1 year, because they placed, what, first or second in that tasting. And so the whole thing changed. It was really dramatic, and you can contrast that with my first visit to San Francisco in 1980, trying to sell Pinot, and Steve says the frustration. You'd walk into the wine shops, you'd pour your wine to them, and they would say, well, it's sort of okay, you know. It's a decent $7 bottle of Bourgogne.
This is a hidebound industry. People move very, very slowly at all levels. Winemakers, retailers, restaurateurs, distributors, they don't see a great new wine and immediately glom onto it, or a new producing region. It takes years of beating them down before they finally recognize how good this place is. The wines here have been good from the start.
Yeah.
It's not like we finally learned how to make wine. They have been good from the start. David Letts and Dick Ponzi's and Dickie, those wines are fine from the get-go. But it takes years in this industry to change people's minds.
Right.
So that's your main marketing technique? Breaking people down?
In the early days, that's exactly what it was all about. You simply had to be in their face. And you had to embarrass them by making them, by doing a Burgundy blind versus an Oregon, and have them tell you that this wine from Oregon is not very good and this wine from Burgundy is obviously great, and then pointing out that they've got it backwards. This happened over and over again. And we didn't do this commercially in the sense of a big tasting, but the one time. And that needs to be pointed out, that Myron and I, selling for other Oregon wineries at that time, would often ask a retailer to sell us a bottle of Burgundy and then brown bag them. But we didn't do this in a formal tasting where this would get into the press. We only did that the one time because we have great respect for Burgundy. Yeah. This is the home of Pinot, and the producers of Burgundy have been very helpful to us in Oregon in teaching us how to make better wine. We only did it because we had to get somebody's attention. And since 1985, we have not done an industry-sponsored comparison between Burgundy and Oregon Pinot.
Right. Yeah, I mean, but as I said, in 80, when you had this problem and you went into a wine shop and people treated you that way, I found that I didn't even have to put the Burgundy in a brown bag. After the guy would tell me that my $15 wine was terribly overpriced, I would just say, get anything off your shelf that's over double. Go up and pick a Burgundy, I'll buy it. Pour it next to my wine, try the two, and then tell me that my wine is still inferior, not in the same playing field. And, you know, I was taking incredible risks, but it never, you know, a lot of the time the guy would say, oh, I like the Burgundy, but they always changed their opinion about our wine once they saw the comparison. And that's all we were trying to do, is to change the playing field. We're not trying to say that we're better than Burgundy. We're just trying to say, hey guys, we're a northern cool climate. We use limited yields. You know, we do leaf pulling. We do shoot positioning. We do
traditional practices.
Traditional practices.
Cool climate, Northern European practices.
And we make great Pinot too. And we make great Oregon Pinot. And they make great Burgundy. And we're both.
The first time that I started Cary Oregon Wines to market a bunch of Oregon wineries in 1983. And in the winter of '83, I loaded up my brother's pickup truck This was between Christmas and New Year's, and it was dead winter across the country, of course. I loaded up this pickup truck with 30 cases of samples, and I drove to New York with him. I dropped him off in Maryland where he went to firefighter school, and then I took his pickup and I drove into New York City. And I went to distributors and said, I'm from Oregon, I represent David Adelsheim and Myron Redford and Erath and Bethel Heights, and there was a whole string, there was a bunch of wine in the car, and I said, we'd like you to sell our wines. And they said, well, no, Ari gone, you know, I don't know what you guys are doing out there, but forget it. You know, we got plenty of wine already, we don't need any new wine. And I got so frustrated talking, or not talking to distributors because they wouldn't even talk to me, that I finally found this one upstart little company that was just getting going, a little place called Winebow. And I approached the partner, Peter Matt, and I said, look, these are really good wines, and you should be selling them. You're an upstart company, you're just getting on your feet, we can help you and you can help us. And I said, will you take us on? And Peter said, no, I wouldn't, you know, I can't do that. I said, look, if I go out into the market this week on my own and ride that subway up and down this island and get orders, will you fill them and take the markup as a distributor? And he said, well, I guess I can do that. So I got in the subway with my bag of samples and I started calling on retail shops cold turkey. Didn't know people from one end to the other, didn't know their names, didn't know anything. Just walked in and poured the wines for them. And I came back in 4 days and handed Peter an order for 2 pallets of wine. And I said, will you take that? And he said, yes. And we've been in business ever since.